In the heart of a city where dreams and danger danced together on every street corner, where jazz notes floated through smoke-filled rooms and whispers of power echoed through dark alleyways, one name would rise from the shadows to become legend. This is the story of a single day that changed everything, a moment frozen in time when Harlem's underworld shifted beneath the feet of those who thought they controlled it. It is the story of a man whose very nickname spoke of the battles he had fought since childhood, a man whose arrival in Harlem would reshape the criminal landscape of an entire community. This is not just a tale of violence and vengeance, but a chronicle of survival, strategy, and the iron will require to carve out a kingdom in the most unforgiving territory imaginable. Before the world knew him as the godfather of Harlem, before his name became synonymous with power and respect, there was a day when everything changed. That day was in 1931, and what happened would echo through generations, inspiring stories, legends, and eventually the man who would become one of the most influential figures in American organized crime history. This is the entire story of how Harlem learned the name Bumpy Johnson. The young man who would become known as Bumpy Johnson arrived in Harlem carrying more than just the few belongings he could pack. He carried with him the weight of a difficult childhood in South Carolina, where poverty was not just a condition, but a way of life that shaped every decision and every dream. Born Ellsworth Raymond Johnson in Charleston in 1905, he grew up in a world where opportunities for young black men were scarce, and the future often looked as bleak as the hot southern summers were long. His nickname came not from any romantic origin, but from a painful reality, the bumps and lumps that covered his head from a childhood illness that left him marked and different from other children. In a world where being different could mean being targeted, young Ellsworth learned early that he would have to fight for everything he wanted and defend everything he had. His family struggled like so many others, caught between the old ways of the South and the promises of something better that always seemed just out of reach. When the opportunity came to leave South Carolina behind and head north to Harlem, it felt like a chance at redemption, a possibility to escape the suffocating limitations of Southern segregation, and find a place where a smart and determined young man might actually make something of himself. Harlem in the early 1930s was a place of remarkable contradictions that pulled at the soul of everyone who lived there. On one hand, it was the cultural capital of Black America, the birthplace of the Harlem Renaissance where writers, musicians, artists, and intellectuals gathered to create something unprecedented in American culture. The streets thrummed with creative energy, as jazz clubs opened their doors each night to crowds eager to hear the newest sounds and the hottest performers. Poets recited their verses in small cafes, while painters captured the vibrant life of the neighborhood on canvas, and everyone seemed to believe that Harlem represented the future of black excellence in America. But beneath this glittering surface, another Harlem existed, one where the Great Depression had hit the black community with devastating force. Unemployment rates soared far higher than in white neighborhoods, families struggled to pay rent in overcrowded tenements, and the dream of prosperity that had drawn so many north during the Great Migration seemed to crumble a little more each day. Into this divided world came the young man from South Carolina, carrying his southern accent and his head full of bumps, looking for opportunity in whatever form it might take. The criminal underworld of Harlem in 1930 was controlled by forces that seemed as immovable as mountains. White mobsters from downtown Manhattan had extended their reach into the neighborhood, seeing the predominantly black community as territory to be exploited rather than protected. They ran the numbers rackets, controlled the speakeasies that flourished during Prohibition, and took the lion's share of profits from enterprises that served the Harlem community while giving almost nothing back. The local black criminals who worked for these downtown bosses were often treated as expendable foot soldiers, paid little and respected even less. The numbers game, an illegal lottery system where people could bet small amounts on three-digit numbers in hopes of a big payout, was particularly lucrative because it appealed to working people who had little money but lots of hope. Every day, thousands of Harlem residents placed their bets with runners who collected the money and passed it up the chain to the white mobsters who ultimately controlled the operation. The system was designed to keep the money flowing out of Harlem and into the pockets of outsiders, and anyone who tried to challenge this arrangement usually ended up beaten, arrested, or dead. Young Ellsworth Johnson, now going by Bumpy to everyone he met, understood that succeeding in this environment would require more than just toughness. It would demand intelligence, strategic thinking, and the ability to see opportunities that others missed. He started at the bottom like everyone else, running errands for small-time operators, learning the streets of Harlem block by block, and studying the power dynamics that governed the underworld. He was quiet and observant, watching how deals were made, how disputes were settled, and how respect was earned or lost. What he noticed was that while the white mobsters controlled the big operations, they were completely disconnected from the daily life of the Harlem community. They did not understand the culture, the social networks, the churches, the family structures, or the informal codes that governed behavior in the neighborhood. This disconnect created vulnerabilities, places where a smart operator who truly understood Harlem could find leverage. Bumpy also noticed something else that would prove crucial. The white mobsters were deeply racist and consistently underestimated the intelligence and capability of the black men who worked for them. They saw their black subordinates as simple muscle rather than potential rivals, and this blindness would eventually become their greatest weakness. The relationship that would define Bumpy Johnson's rise began when he caught the attention of Stephanie St. Clair, one of the most remarkable figures in Harlem's criminal history. Known as Queenie or Madame St. Clair, she was a black woman from Martinique who had built her own numbers operation through sheer force of will and business acumen. In a world dominated by men, both black and white, she had carved out her own territory and refused to bow to the pressure from downtown mobsters who wanted to take over her operation. She was elegant, educated, and absolutely fearless, qualities that made her both admired and feared throughout Harlem. When she needed someone she could trust, someone smart enough to handle complex situations and tough enough to stand up to threats, she found that person in the young man with the scarred head and the watchful eyes. Bumpy Johnson became Stephanie St. Clair's chief enforcer and strategist, a role that would give him the platform he needed to demonstrate his capabilities. He was not just muscle for hire. He was a thinker who could plan operations, anticipate problems, and execute plans with precision. Under her mentorship, he learned the business side of crime, understanding that sustainable power came not just from violence but from building systems, creating loyalty, and knowing when to fight and when to negotiate. The year 1931 was building toward a confrontation that had been inevitable for years. Dutch Schultz, a notorious white gangster from the Bronx, had decided that he wanted complete control of the Harlem numbers racket. He was not interested in sharing or negotiating. He wanted it all, and he was willing to use extreme violence to get it. Schultz was known for his brutality and his complete lack of moral restraint, and when he moved into a territory, he brought with him gunmen, corrupt police officers, and a reputation for leaving bodies in his wake. He had already muscled out several smaller operators in Harlem, and now he was setting his sights on Stephanie St. Clair's operation. The pressure came in waves, first with threats delivered through intermediaries, then with attacks on her runners and collectors, and finally with direct confrontations designed to make her abandon her business or face destruction. Most people expected her to fold, to take whatever money she could salvage and disappear, because standing up to Dutch Schultz seemed like suicide. But Stephanie St. Clair was not most people, and in Bumpy Johnson, she had someone who was equally unwilling to back down. The day that would become legendary in Harlem history started like many others, with the normal rhythms of neighborhood life playing out across the blocks and tenements. Street vendors set up their carts, children headed to school or played in the streets, and the numbers runners began their daily routes collecting bets from customers who hoped today might be their lucky day. But beneath this surface normalcy, tensions were reaching a breaking point. Dutch Schultz had sent word that this was the day Stephanie St. Clair would surrender her operation, and he had sent a crew of his most violent enforcers to make sure the message was received. They were not coming to negotiate. They were coming to take over by force, to beat down anyone who resisted, and to make an example that would discourage other independent operators from thinking they could stand against white mob power. What Schultz and his men did not know was that Bumpy Johnson had been preparing for this confrontation, studying their patterns, identifying their weaknesses, and planning a response that would shock everyone who thought they understood how power worked in Harlem. The confrontation happened in broad daylight on a busy Harlem street, a bold move that was designed to send a message to the entire neighborhood. Dutch Schultz's men arrived in expensive cars, dressed in suits that announced their prosperity and power, carrying weapons that bulged obviously under their jackets. They walked into a social club that served as one of Stephanie St. Clair's operational headquarters, expecting to find frightened people ready to surrender. Instead, they found Bumpy Johnson waiting for them with a calm expression and a level gaze that showed no fear whatsoever. The lead enforcer for Schultz, a man known for his violent temper and his willingness to hurt anyone who showed disrespect, immediately started making threats and demands. He told Bumpy that the operation now belonged to Dutch Schultz, that anyone who resisted would be dealt with harshly, and that this was not a negotiation but a simple statement of reality. The other patrons in the social club watched nervously, expecting violence to erupt at any moment, expecting to see Bumpy beaten or killed for daring to stand in the way of the powerful white gangsters. What happened next would be talked about in Harlem for decades afterward. Bumpy Johnson did not flinch or back down or show any sign of intimidation. Instead, he spoke with a quiet confidence that was somehow more threatening than any loud boast or angry retort could have been. He told Schultz's enforcer that Harlem was not some territory that could be taken by outsiders who did not understand or respect the community. He explained that the people of Harlem would not accept being exploited by downtown mobsters who saw them only as sources of profit. He made it clear that any attempt to take over by force would be met with a level of resistance that Schultz had not anticipated, and that the cost of trying to conquer Harlem would be far higher than the rewards could ever justify. The enforcer, unused to being challenged so directly, responded with physical violence, lunging at Bumpy with the intention of beating him into submission right there in front of everyone. What the enforcer did not expect was that Bumpy Johnson was not just tough but highly skilled in street fighting, with reflexes honed by years of having to defend himself, and a complete absence of fear when it came to physical confrontation. The fight was brutal and swift, and when it ended, Dutch Schultz's chief enforcer lay unconscious on the floor while Bumpy Johnson stood over him, barely breathing hard. The message was clear and unmistakable. The days of Harlem being pushed around by outside forces were coming to an end. The other enforcers who had come with their leader faced a choice: escalate the violence right there and risk a full-scale war they were not prepared for, or retreat and report back to Schultz that they had encountered unexpected resistance. They chose retreat, carrying their unconscious colleague out of the social club while the assembled Harlem residents watched in stunned amazement. Word of what had happened spread through the neighborhood with astonishing speed, growing and evolving with each retelling, until it took on almost mythical proportions. The young man with the bumps on his head had stood up to Dutch Schultz's crew and won, had defended black-owned business against white mob aggression, had shown that resistance was possible even when the odds seemed impossible. The name Bumpy Johnson became something different after that day. Before, he had been known to people in certain circles as a competent enforcer and a smart operator. After that day, he became a symbol of defiance and strength, a figure who represented the possibility that Harlem could control its own destiny rather than being controlled by outside forces. Young men in the neighborhood started talking about him with admiration, seeing in him a model of how to carry yourself with dignity and power, even in a world designed to keep you down. Business owners who had been paying protection money to various mob-connected operators started wondering if there might be another way, if they might find protection from someone who actually cared about the Harlem community. Stephanie St. Clair's operation gained new respect and new recruits, as people who had been sitting on the sidelines decided they wanted to be part of something that felt like resistance rather than just another criminal enterprise. The cultural impact rippled outward beyond just the criminal underworld, touching musicians, writers, and activists who saw in Bumpy Johnson's stand a reflection of the broader struggle for black self-determination and dignity. Dutch Schultz was predictably enraged when he learned what had happened. His reputation was built on the idea that no one could stand against him, that resistance was futile and would only result in worse punishment. Having his crew humiliated in Harlem threatened to undermine his standing throughout the New York underworld, and he knew that if he did not respond with overwhelming force, other operators in other neighborhoods might start to think they could challenge him as well. He began planning a major offensive against Stephanie St. Clair's operation, intending to flood Harlem with gunmen and wage a campaign of terror that would break any resistance. He used his connections with corrupt police officers to arrange for raids on St. Clair's establishments, hoping to use the law as a weapon to accomplish what his enforcers had failed to do. He also reached out to other white mob leaders, explaining that what was happening in Harlem was a threat to all of them, that if black operators were allowed to maintain independence, it could inspire similar movements in other neighborhoods. The stage was being set for a larger conflict that would test whether Bumpy Johnson's bold stand had been the beginning of real change or just a temporary disruption that would be crushed by superior force. Bumpy Johnson understood that winning one confrontation did not mean winning the war. He knew that Dutch Schultz would come back harder, and that the next phase of the conflict would require more than just personal toughness. He began organizing a network of allies throughout Harlem, reaching out to other independent operators who were tired of being squeezed by downtown mobs. He built relationships with community leaders, including some ministers and business owners who were not involved in criminal activity, but who appreciated having someone standing up for Harlem's interests. He also studied the tactics and operations of the various mob families, learning about their internal politics, their rivalries, and their vulnerabilities. One of his key insights was that the white mob bosses were not as unified as they appeared, that they competed with each other as much as they cooperated, and that smart strategy could exploit these divisions. He also recognized that public opinion mattered, that if the people of Harlem saw the conflict as being about outside exploitation versus community self-determination, they would be more likely to support resistance even when it came at a cost. The battles that followed throughout the rest of 1931 and into the years beyond were not always dramatic confrontations like the one that made Bumpy Johnson famous. Much of the conflict played out in smaller skirmishes, in negotiations and betrayals, in shifting alliances and calculated risks. There were moments of violence when Schultz's gunmen targeted St. Clair's operations, and when Bumpy's crew responded with their own attacks. There were legal battles as Stephanie St. Clair was eventually arrested and imprisoned on charges that everyone knew were motivated by her refusal to surrender to mob control. There were economic pressures as the white mobs tried to cut off supply lines and corrupt police tried to shut down operations. Through it all, Bumpy Johnson continued to grow in stature and influence, demonstrating a combination of strategic intelligence and personal courage that made him indispensable to the resistance effort. He became known not just as an enforcer, but as a leader who could make hard decisions, build coalitions, and maintain discipline among his followers. The transformation of Bumpy Johnson from a young man seeking opportunity to a legendary figure in Harlem happened gradually but irreversibly. Each successful operation, each threat neutralized, each challenge overcome added to his reputation and expanded his influence. He developed a reputation for being fair in his dealings with people in the community, for not preying on ordinary residents the way some criminals did, and for using violence selectively rather than indiscriminately. This earned him a level of respect and even affection that purely predatory criminals never received. People in Harlem knew he was a criminal, knew he was involved in illegal activities, but they also felt that he was their criminal, someone who understood their struggles and who stood between them and worse exploitation. This relationship with the community was something the white mob bosses could never replicate, and it gave Bumpy a foundation of support that made him far more formidable than his resources alone would suggest. As the years passed, Bumpy Johnson's role evolved beyond just enforcer and strategist. He became a political figure in the informal power structure of Harlem, someone who could settle disputes, provide assistance to families in need, and mediate conflicts before they escalated into violence. He developed relationships with legitimate political figures and civil rights leaders who recognized that he had influence in parts of the community they could not reach. He was never romanticized as some kind of hero in his own mind. He understood that he was operating in a criminal world and that the violence he engaged in had real costs. But he also believed that what he was doing was necessary, that in the absence of legitimate protection and opportunity for black communities, people like him provided a necessary function. This moral complexity was part of what made him such a compelling figure, neither entirely villain nor entirely hero, but something more complicated that reflected the complicated reality of life in Harlem during that era. The impact of that day in 1931, when Harlem learned the name Bumpy Johnson, extended far beyond the immediate criminal conflict with Dutch Schultz. It represented a turning point in the history of organized crime in black communities, demonstrating that independence was possible and that black operators could build their own power structures rather than always serving as subordinates to white mobs. In the years that followed, Harlem's numbers racket would gradually come under the control of black operators rather than downtown white gangsters, a shift that kept more money circulating within the community, even as the operations themselves remained illegal. Bumpy Johnson would go on to become one of the most powerful and influential figures in Harlem for decades, his career encompassing partnerships with other major crime figures, periods of imprisonment, and continuing influence over the neighborhood's underworld. His legend would inspire countless stories, appearing in books, movies, and television shows that recognized him as a pivotal figure in the history of American organized crime. The broader cultural significance of Bumpy Johnson's rise cannot be separated from the context of black struggle in America during the 20th century. He emerged at a time when legal avenues for black advancement were severely limited, when discrimination closed off most paths to legitimate success, and when black communities were systematically exploited by outside forces with no legal recourse. In this environment, figures like Bumpy represented a form of resistance and self-determination that resonated deeply even with people who would never engage in criminal activity themselves. He showed that black men did not have to accept subordinate roles, did not have to bow to white authority, and could build independent power structures through intelligence and courage. This symbolic importance meant that Bumpy Johnson became more than just a criminal. He became an icon of black resistance and dignity in the face of oppression. Later generations would look back on his career with complex feelings, recognizing both the harm caused by criminal activity and the courage required to stand up against powerful forces that wanted to keep black communities subjugated. The relationship between Bumpy Johnson and the Harlem community remained complex throughout his life. He was involved in illegal activities that could harm individuals and families, particularly the numbers racket that encouraged gambling among people who could not afford to lose money. At the same time, he was known for generosity toward people in need, for providing jobs in an environment where legitimate employment was scarce, and for standing up to outside threats whether they came from rival criminals or corrupt police. Many families in Harlem had mixed feelings about him, grateful for his occasional assistance, but wary of the violence and illegality that surrounded him. This ambivalence reflected broader questions about how communities survive when legitimate systems fail them, and what kinds of alternative structures emerge when conventional morality offers no practical solutions to real problems. Bumpy Johnson operated in this moral gray zone for his entire career, never pretending to be something he was not, but also never abandoning his sense of connection to the community that had embraced him. The law enforcement response to Bumpy Johnson's activities over the years was complicated by racism and corruption within the police and justice systems. While officials publicly condemned crime in Harlem, many police officers were on the take from various criminal operations and had little interest in actually stopping the activities they were supposedly fighting. Bumpy himself would be arrested multiple times over his career and would spend significant periods in prison. But these incarcerations were often seen by Harlem residents as politically motivated attempts to break black-controlled operations rather than as legitimate law enforcement. The fact that white mobsters who engaged in identical or worse activities often faced lighter penalties or no prosecution at all was not lost on anyone. This double standard reinforced the sense that Bumpy Johnson and others like him were being targeted not because of what they did, but because of who they were, and because they represented black independence that threatened white control. Each time Bumpy emerged from prison, he was welcomed back into Harlem as a returning hero rather than as a criminal who had been justly punished, a reception that testified to the complex relationship between the community and the man. As Bumpy Johnson aged and the world around him changed, he had to adapt to new realities in both the criminal underworld and the broader society. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s opened up new possibilities for black advancement through legitimate channels, changing the calculus that had made criminal enterprise seem like the only path to power and respect. The drug trade began to transform the nature of organized crime, bringing new levels of violence and social destruction that differed from the relatively contained world of numbers running and illegal gambling. Younger criminals emerged who were less interested in community connection and more focused on pure profit maximization, regardless of the social cost. Bumpy found himself in the position of being an old-school figure in a rapidly changing world, trying to maintain standards and codes that younger operators dismissed as outdated. His relationships with civil rights leaders became more prominent during this period, as people like Malcolm X recognized that Bumpy had influence and resources that could be useful to the movement. These interactions added another layer to his complex legacy, connecting him to the broader struggle for black freedom even as he continued his criminal activities. The final years of Bumpy Johnson's life were spent watching Harlem change in ways that both encouraged and troubled him. The neighborhood faced challenges from urban decay, disinvestment, and the rising drug epidemic that would devastate many black communities in the 1970s and 80s. The numbers racket that had been the foundation of black organized crime in Harlem was increasingly supplanted by state-run lotteries that took over what had been an illegal market. The power structures that Bumpy had spent decades building were being challenged by new forces that operated according to different rules. Yet even as his influence waned with age and changing times, his reputation remained strong, and his name continued to carry weight in the neighborhood. When he died in 1968, thousands of people turned out for his funeral, a testament to the complicated but genuine connection he had maintained with the Harlem community throughout his life. The mourners included criminals and legitimate citizens, people who had worked with him, and people who had simply lived in the neighborhood he dominated, all coming together to acknowledge the passing of a figure who had shaped their world in profound ways. The legend of Bumpy Johnson has only grown in the decades since his death, as historians, filmmakers, and writers have discovered his story and recognized its significance. He has been portrayed in numerous books and movies, sometimes romanticized beyond recognition, and sometimes demonized as a simple gangster. but increasingly understood as a complex figure who operated in a complex environment. The question of how to evaluate his legacy remains contentious, dividing people who emphasize the harm caused by criminal activity from those who emphasize the resistance to oppression and the agency he demonstrated. What cannot be disputed is that he was historically significant, a figure who helped shape the development of organized crime in black communities, and who represented a particular response to the limited options available to black men in mid-20th century America. His life raises difficult questions about justice, opportunity, community, and survival that have no easy answers but demand serious consideration. In the end, the story of that day in 1931, when Harlem learned the name Bumpy Johnson, is about more than just one man or one confrontation. It is about the intersection of race, class, crime, and community in America during a period of tremendous upheaval and transformation. It is about what happens when legitimate paths to dignity and success are blocked, and how people create alternative structures to meet needs that society refuses to address. It is about courage and violence, generosity and exploitation, resistance and harm, all tangled together in ways that defy simple moral categories. Bumpy Johnson became legendary not because he was perfect or because he represented unambiguous good, but because he embodied contradictions that were real and important. He showed that black men could build power in a world designed to deny them power, that intelligence and strategy could overcome superior force, and that loyalty to community could coexist with criminal activity. These lessons resonated in Harlem in 1931 and continue to resonate today, ensuring that the name Bumpy Johnson will not be forgotten as long as people remember the complicated history of black urban America in the 20th century.